Hello Africa, welcome to Investments for Impact, a Vilgro Africa podcast. In this season, we are focused on the topic of fundraising. Welcome to our bonus episode, the final episode of the season, where we zoom in on a particular grant funding opportunity, the USAID DIV program. Thank you for joining us.
So we could start with an introduction. Liz, maybe you could introduce yourself and say something small about your professional background.
Sure. Well, first, I wanted to just thank you for the invite to speak today. It's great to have the opportunity to share about DIV and to speak with you again after such a long time. In terms of my background, I started in financial services. That was the first half of my career. And then I switched to the development sector. And in the development sector, I have worked with the World Bank, impact investors, and most recently with USAID to tackle the problems that most small, medium enterprises and social enterprises in developing markets face today, which is access to finance and capacity building. I've been with USAID for the last 6.5 years and on the DIV team for the last 3.5 years. And on DIV, I review applications, I take them through the diligence process, and then I manage the DIV grants after they've been approved. I also lead our venture assistance portfolio, which is an opportunity for grantees to receive targeted technical assistance.
Thank you for that, Liz. So most people in development circles at least will know about USAID. But just in case there's someone listening who has never heard of USAID, maybe you could just talk a bit about what USAID is and then also tell us a bit about the DIV program.
Certainly. So USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, supports the U.S. government's foreign policy, and it's the lead agency on international development and disaster assistance. DIV it stands for Development Innovation Ventures, and it's USAID's enterprise-driven open innovation fund. I know, that's a mouthful. It's what invests in breakthrough solutions to some of the world's most intractable development challenges for the base of the pyramid. We define innovation very broadly. It can be technologies, products, services, new ways of delivering or financing services and goods, new ways of increasing uptake of existing proven solutions or policy shifts based on learnings from behavioral economics. And this could be solutions that improve literacy and numeracy in primary school or affordable solar energy for rural communities that aren't connected to the national grid system, or it could be providing critical medicines to hard-to-reach communities via drones. We provide grant funding to test new ideas, build evidence on what works, and scale solutions that could impact millions of lives at the base of the pyramid at just a fraction of the usual cost. DIV is unique from most of USAID's other programs because we're open to innovators from any sector, any geography where USAID has a presence, and a broad swath of innovators, which means nonprofits, for-profits, research institutes, academic institutes, and even foreign governments. And we have 4 categories of funding. The first 3 categories are in stages, and they're for new innovations. So stage 1 is called the pilot stage, and that's up to $200,000. That's used to support post-prototype, post-ideation innovations that are ready to be piloted in a developing country. Stage 2 is for testing and positioning for scale, and that is up to $1.5 million. And it's used to further test innovations that proved successful during piloting and gather rigorous evidence of impact. Stage 3 is scaling, and that is up to $15 million. It's used to support the expansion or replication of proven innovations to new locations in a country or to a new country. And then throughout these three stages, DIV is open to funding the innovators to conduct operational expansion, impact evaluations, or a mix of the two, depending on what the grantee needs. The fourth window is a little different. It's called the evidence grant window, and that is up to 1.5 million. That is for development approaches that are widely used, but do not yet have sufficient evidence from rigorous evaluations of causal impact and cost effectiveness. So that could be something like the impact of footbridges. And these grants can support impact evaluations even if the underlying development approaches being tested are not inherently innovative.
Interesting. So it sounds like you're saying, Liz, that DIV is basically targeted more at experimentation and then scaling those approaches that are found through experimentation to be successful. Would that be a correct assessment?
Yes, I think that's a good way of looking at it. We are happy to provide small amounts of funding to test new ideas and to see what works or what doesn't. And then once we have that rigorous evidence of impact, then we will double down and help scale it up.
Thank you. So a big question that I have, and you've just alluded a bit to that, is that USAID is really known more for funding the not-for-profit sector. So before we get into the questions for our audience, that is mainly going to be startups, my question is, what's the reasoning behind offering non-returnable capital to entities that have a profit motive? This because I know that a large chunk of your grants are to the private sector.
So DIV is really focused on supporting solutions that can achieve development outcomes better, faster, or cheaper than alternatives and can generate evidence that proves it. We are less focused on the type of organization. DIV is cognizant that the funding challenges that early stage innovators face is regardless of their profit motivations, they all face the same kind of funding challenges. And we understand that there's an important role that grant funding can play in de-risking these solutions, as well as generating evidence of what can work or isn't working. And so once the innovation matures and is able to demonstrate that rigorous evidence of impact, we draw a stronger distinction between profit-motivated organizations and nonprofits by analyzing their business model and whether there's a clear need for non-dilutive capital. But we think about that more so in the later stages of funding as we are assessing the applicant.
Okay, thanks. So I like that. So evidence-supported solutions, better, faster, cheaper.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Yeah, so this season of the podcast is mainly focused on fundraising. And at Vilgrow Africa, we are an incubator. And one of the common complaints we hear about from startups coming into our portfolio and even in the ecosystem around us is the lack of funding. That's really a big issue for a lot of startups. But then on the other hand, we hear investors complaining that they're not seeing a strong enough pipeline of high quality deals. So that's part of the reason we decided to invite investors to the table to speak to this question. So for you at DIV, what are you looking for? What would you say is your key criteria?
I'm glad you asked that question because I think it can be confusing for a lot of folks. DIV has just 3 core criteria that we apply to every application: rigorous evidence of impact, cost effectiveness, and the potential to scale. So I'll go into each one of those to try and help unpack it a little bit. So on the first one, rigorous evidence of impact. We heavily prioritize the importance of the rigorous evidence generation in order to demonstrate what works and what doesn't work. We care about both in the development space. We're looking for different indicators of impact or plans to measure the impact depending on the stage of financing that the applicant is seeking and the proposed pathway to scale. So this means going beyond just counting the number of customers and demonstrating what the social or economic impacts are. And we rely on evidence and we fund research to test new solutions to development challenges. Many of our grantees conduct randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, to meet this criteria, but that's not always required. And particularly if you're a for-profit organization scaling through commercial means, that's not always required. We have the lens through which we assess our criteria will vary a little bit depending on whether it's a innovation that scales commercially or publicly or through some sort of mix. On cost effectiveness, we are investing in solutions that demonstrate the potential to deliver maximum impact for every dollar. So we invest in solutions that can prove they're cheaper, faster, or better, or more impactful than their respective alternatives. And that's really important to be able to have that comparison point. And we're not expecting that the innovation is the most cost-effective intervention at the time of the award, but we look for clear indicators that could be possible as the innovation is scaling. And then on the point of potential to scale, we define scale as improving millions of lives within 10 years and look for solutions that have that potential. We recognize that innovations can take a variety of pathways to scale. So it could be private, public, or hybrid. We don't place heavier emphasis on one or the other. And regardless of which pathway the innovator follows, we're expecting that they'll be financially sustainable and ultimately grow without continued DIV support. We don't want to just continue to throw money into something indefinitely. There's a lot of great ideas there. We want to help push those along, but others should also be coming into this. So just to give an example of, like a hypothetical example of what all of the criteria could look like with an application. Let's think about at-home test kits for an illness like TB. The results could be available within hours instead of days like they are now, and they could be 99% accurate. The innovator could partner with local clinics to provide the test kits very cheaply to patients, and then in conjunction with local the health offices provide affordable treatments as well as track the health outcomes from the solution. At scale, that solution has the potential to impact millions of lives of people because TB kills like 2 to 3 million people every year. It's a really generic example that I've just given, but I hope that illustrates what DIV criteria looks like in practice.
Thank you for that. Curious to find out, the question of sustainability. How does that look like outside of the private sector? Like for when you're talking about nonprofits, for instance, what do you expect in terms of sustainability?
It's going to depend on their model, but if the nonprofit didn't have a earned revenue stream, it's okay if they are anticipating that the government would be the main customer, paying for the solution going forward, or it could be some sort of mix of, maybe there is some amount that, let's say, farmers are paying for ag extension services, but then they still need donor funding for a portion of time. That's still okay, but we'd also want to see that the portion of donor funding declines over time. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. So what I hear you saying is that you don't necessarily expect 100% sustainability. What you more want to see is progress towards a level of sustainability.
Yes, we would like to see that progress over time. And again, it is just going to depend on what is that business model, whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. Who's going to take it up afterwards? Because DIV won't be able to sustain the funding for that innovation indefinitely, and we shouldn't be.
So when you look at other sources of funding, other investors out there in the ecosystem, how do you differ primarily with other sources of funding?
I think that probably depends on who you compare us to, but I think some key distinctions are grant funding, flexible grant funding. So we, when we work with the grantee after an award has been approved, we will establish milestones for tranching out the funding. And those milestones are based on a mix of outcome and output targets. But that funding can be used, as I mentioned before, for operational expenses, or it can be used for an impact evaluation. It can be used for some sort of mix. We're not saying buy 100 widgets and then show us the proof for that. It's more about, we agree that the funding you are being allocated is to achieve certain objectives. You have the flexibility to shift within over the course of a grant period in terms of how you will utilize that funding towards different categories of expenses to allow you to maximize it and achieve the expected outcomes. I think another difference is just the criteria that we focus on and how we are rigorously focused on generating evidence and then making decisions based on that evidence in terms of like further support and what to support. And we are pretty open in terms of the type of organizations we will support, the pathway to scale, and even our definition of innovation. And then I would say another distinction from some other funders is that we will provide, or we can provide, targeted technical assistance to help the grantees with some of those nitty gritty operational needs that we expect will help them scale and achieve their impact objectives. And so I think that those are a couple of the things that make us stand out a little bit from other funders.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm quite glad to hear you talk about that, because really what we hear from entrepreneurs is that they need flexible funding, and you guys are providing just that. So my next question is around process. So how does your vetting process look like? How long does it take to go through to approval, assuming that you have a high quality application in your hands? And as you answer that, could you also talk about what kind of an organization, would be like a perfect fit for DIV?
Sure. So starting with that last question, again, this goes back to DIV focuses on innovation, not the organization type. So your innovation can be at an early stage, as long as it's prototype. It could be at a growth stage, or it could be at a mature stage, because we have different levels of funding that can target an innovation at a different stage in its development journey. And we take a portfolio approach, and we're providing that tiered funding to match the amount of risk that's involved. So we take those relatively smaller, high risk bets, so that's stage one. on the earlier stage innovations and then invest larger amounts of money in the later stage innovations that are able to better demonstrate that evidence of impact. And then the idea is that this approach is going to maximize the social impact of the overall portfolio. Because at the end of the day, like, that's what we really care about. Like, how are we impacting the lives of base of the pyramid? So in terms of our process to assess the applicants, first, it's important to know we're open year-round. And the vetting process can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months. It depends on the complexity of the application, the amount of funding that's requested. So the more funding you ask for, the longer it's going to take to really vet it. And even the time of year for us. Sometimes certain times of the year can be busier for us than other times of the year. So from start to finish, there are about 4 stages. And the first stage is the preliminary application review. Applications are reviewed about 1 to 2 or 3 months after submission, and then the applicants will be notified if they progress into our diligence phase or if they're rejected. And the next stage is diligence, and that can take anywhere from 2 to 5 months, and that depends on different factors, like I mentioned, particularly the proposal's complexity and the amount of funding that's being requested. During this time, there's a lot of back and forth where we're asking applicants questions, we're consulting experts about their responses. There's an opportunity for co-creation as well. So it can take a couple of months. And then if it's completed the diligence process, and we think it's ready for presenting for a decision, it'll be presented before a decision panel of internal and external experts. They make the decision. And then if they give it a green light, then we move, that's fabulous. And then we move into some of the nitty gritty aspects of contracting with USAID. And that involves establishing the milestones that I mentioned before, and then completing USAID-specific procurement paperwork. And there's a lot of that. So because of that, all of that paperwork, that can take another 3 to 5 months. Regardless of where the application is and how long it takes, we always keep the applicants updated about where they are in the process, and we will share feedback about the proposal, regardless of whether they receive the award from us or not, because that's really important. I think, they give us a lot, but we want to give them something in return. And we hope that feedback from us, from the different experts that we consulted, is useful for them going forward.
Wonderful. I mean, what if an application is unsuccessful? Can they go back, work on the feedback that you shared and resubmit?
Absolutely. Applicants are always welcome to resubmit their applications as often as they want. It doesn't matter where in the process they might have been rejected. There's no guarantee that if they resubmit and they address that feedback that they'll definitely be successful, but it certainly helps to take that feedback into consideration. But again, they are always welcome to come back and resubmit. DIV reads every application. So it's not just like some bot. We are taking the time because we want to really give the applicant that opportunity, and we read every single application that comes through. So people shouldn't feel like it just goes into a black box.
I like that, and it's very similar to the Vilgro process, where we see our value to the ecosystem as the feedback that we provide, so that even unsuccessful applicants can find value in the learning process from the feedback that we share.
Exactly.
So moving on to the post-investment stage, how does that look like? What can successful applicants expect from you in that phase, and what do you expect from them?
Sure, I touched on this a little bit earlier. One of the key things to keep in mind is the grants are milestone based and funding is dispersed in tranches that align with those milestones. And we agree on that, on those milestones before the award is finalized. So those milestones are some mix of the outcomes and the outputs that we're mutually seeking to achieve. For example, there could be targets for customer acquisition or revenue, or expectations that the learnings from business model iterations will be shared in public settings or through a report. Or we might want to know about how much follow-on funding is raised to see how much USAID has helped catalyze. So it can vary, but it is a mix, and we want to help encourage the grantees to achieve the objectives of the proposal. And the awards are typically 3 years in length, so the milestones will be spread out during that time. They can be shorter. There's no compulsion to have it to complete it in 3 years. In addition to those milestones, there'll be a couple of KPIs, sort of standard KPIs, that are reported on twice a year. We also, there are a couple of, I think, benefits that we offer. So aside from the flexible funding, which can be used for, brand research, tech upgrades, we're also able to provide access to the USAID network. We strive to connect our grantees as much as possible to focal points across our local missions or offices in country, as well as in DC, where I'm based. We are a open door to USAID, which means we know that it's really tricky to apply for USAID funding for the first time. And, we're providing DIV is that open door, and the team itself works really hard to help guide the organization through the whole process. Because again, it can be long, it can be confusing, and we want to be there to help the applicant out. And we will provide access to other funders or partners in our network where it makes sense. And as I mentioned earlier, there's venture assistance, which is essentially targeted technical assistance to a subset of innovators to address really specific needs, like maybe sales training or back office accounting services or fundraising support. The idea is this TA should help the grantees move beyond their operational challenges and really help them achieve those impact objectives.
Wow, that's a lot. Thanks. I actually didn't know about this, and it's really good to hear that you're providing that level of support, in addition to the funding, which those are significant tickets. So thank you for that. So my next question takes us a bit deeper into Vilgro's work. So just to give you some background, about 50% of Vilgro's portfolio is comprised of hardware companies. And these are innovators that are, in some cases, inventing or innovating. Basically, they're building medical diagnostics, diagnostic aids, and other types of hardware from scratch. And typically, this will take about 4 years to get to market. And this kind of entrepreneurs really struggle with obtaining funding because it's really risky for traditional investors, and we understand that. And the other challenge is that a lot of investors also don't understand the space. These companies have to go through product validations to make sure that the devices work. They have to go through clinical testing to make sure they're not causing any harm on patients and that sort of thing. So I'm curious to find out, have you supported such innovators, and what kind of a chance does that kind of innovator stand, and what kind of specific advice would you offer for such applicants?
Yeah, I feel for organizations where they are in that journey and how long it can take. I definitely understand that finding capital is extremely difficult at that stage. It's important to recognize that with DIV, we only invest in prototypes, post prototypes. So innovations that are only at that idea stage or lab testing or just like basic scientific research, we can't fund. We expect that when it's post prototype, the critical aspects of the innovation have been tested. And, there's a lot to be, I think, gained from sharing in that journey that the applicant has had. What kind of learnings they've had in that process to actually incorporate it in their application. So we know that this has been tested, and why it works, why it doesn't work, why it's been created the way it is. We don't have a minimum amount of testing or customers that we expect to see. It really depends on the innovation. So, for example, we invested in a pocket colposcope that could treat or that could screen women for cancer in low resource settings. And when we assessed it, I think it had been tested with just 200 patients and received clearance from the US FDA. But in a completely different instance, we invested in an electric motorcycle that had a working prototype, but had only been tested with 20 customers. So it really does vary on, in terms of what we're looking for. It does vary what kind of testing the innovation has had, but it's really important to recognize we only will support post-prototype.
When you talk about post-prototype stage, are you talking about a functional prototype, or are you talking more about like a manufacturing-ready prototype that has all the approvals and is just at the stage before going to market?
Generally, it should be at the point where it should be ready for market testing. But I think that can also, in terms of approvals and things, I think that might vary depending on what the solution is and who's using it. Something like the pocket colposcope where that's being inserted into women, perhaps it does require certain approvals before it can be used on people for further market testing. But perhaps, if it was a diagnostic tool, it might not need that level of approvals. But again, it's really dependent on the innovation. And we would be reaching out to various experts in that field to help educate us about, is this innovation sort of at the right point for DIV funding and really post prototype.
Thank you for that. A lot of our hardware innovators will really be happy to hear from you on that subject. So moving on, I learned from your website that DIV has received over 12,000 applications, and you have just about a 2% success rate, which is very low. So I'm curious to find out, is this more a question of quality of applications, or is it just that the sheer volume is such that you can only support a few?
I think it's really a mix of factors. One is that, yes, we do have a high volume, but the other is that the quality of the applications is often not very high. And then sometimes there are applications that could be good, but they just aren't a fit with DIV criteria. But I would say overwhelmingly, the majority of applications probably aren't of the highest quality.
Thank you. So that leads us to our next question, which is, what are the major pitfalls for applicants? Where do you see most of them struggling or going wrong?
To start, I think a lot of applicants don't read DIV's annual program statement. That the annual program statement, or the APS, is sort of the solicitation. It describes our core criteria, which I just talked about earlier. It describes how it might vary by funding stage and like what we won't fund. So it's a major pitfall if applicants don't take time to read through that. So, some of the things that they would see if they read through that are, we won't fund the pre-prototypes or the basic scientific research. We won't fund innovations that lack a focus on customers or end users at the base of the pyramid. Though, you can have a diversified customer base, but we do want to, be able to help the base of the pyramid. And we won't fund intermediaries with an indirect impact. So like incubators or accelerators or conveners. Other pitfalls that I've seen are when applicants don't answer the question that's being asked. For instance, they might not describe the problem well or clearly link how their solution is actually addressing the problem that they're talking about. Or they might not demonstrate how or why their solution is cheaper, faster, or better than alternatives. A lot of times they don't even mention their competition, or they claim they don't have any competition. And that demonstrates that they really haven't done their market research. Sometimes they aren't realistic. They might tell us they expect to scale by raising 10 million in equity or debt in 2 years, but they're still at a very nascent stage and they haven't even raised their seed funding round. Or their total addressable market could be 5 million customers and they expect to reach 50% of the market in 2 years, even though they're still at a very early stage. So we have to think twice about that. They don't always have proof points that demonstrate why they know there's a demand or willingness to pay for their product or solution, or that there is any impact. Or they can't explain the assumptions for their projections. And the application isn't very long. It's about 16 questions. But we need just enough context to be able to really get a sense of, can this move into diligence? So being able to, address the questions and be realistic and explain assumptions would be helpful.
All right. Thank you. Then on the other hand, do you ever see applications that are just simply outstanding, where you immediately know this one's a winner? And if so, what are the makings of a good application?
So I will say that there isn't a magic template for what's a stellar application to DIV. We are very broad in terms of what we're looking for. So there's a lot of ways you could meet our criteria. And that's what we're really focused on. So we appreciate when questions are answered directly, succinctly, clearly. You don't need to use, or the applicant doesn't need to use a lot of jargon or technical language or write us a novel. The applicant should just be able to really describe what's the problem, what's the solution, why it works, and what's the potential to scale. So for example, if one of the questions is, what's the theory of change? And provide evidence that supports it. So if you tell me that the problem is that farmers can't get their goods to market, you should be able to explain what are the causes of that problem and how does your solution tackle that problem, and what's the impact on the lives of the farmers, and what evidence do you have that this solution actually works. You should be able to explain the assumptions behind that and the internal and external factors that are important for this solution to succeed and scale. We need to see that there's a reasonable theory of change. And that's, again, goes back to kind of being realistic.
Thank you for that. So DIV has been around for more than 20 years. Actually, sorry, for about 10 years or more than 10 years. And I'm curious to find out, what is it you count as success? And you could speak to this at the programmatic level. You can even also talk about actual success stories, and especially from Africa and even within our sector,
Sure.
the health and life sciences space.
Sure. So I have three examples, which I hope will help give a flavor of what success can look like. So one is Dimagi. Dimagi developed ComCare. It's an adaptable mobile data collection and service delivery platform that works in low resource settings. With support from stage one, they got a $100,000 award, and they piloted and tested the ComCare platform in India. And then following that award, they secured a stage 2 award to iterate on their business model, build the core functionality of ComCare, standardize it, and develop the evidence base for ComCare. And all of that prepared them to support frontline workers working in 100 million households in 130 countries. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, their growth. And as of 2022, more than 90 peer-reviewed studies have demonstrated that ComCare's impact on frontline programs. And in 2020, Dimagi received a third DIV award to evaluate new artificial intelligence feature designed to proactively identify and prioritize high-risk clients, increase diagnostic accuracy, detect outbreaks, and improve care delivery in remote areas. So that's, I think, a good example, within the life sciences kind of space, but in India. If we look at a different example, Zola, they, you might actually be familiar with Zola. They are a provider of solar home systems to off-grid homes across 5 countries in West and East Africa. It's one of the 2 examples on our portfolio that secured all 3 stages of funding. So in stage 1, it was to help them with their first year of operations, and that enabled them to pilot affordable solar leasing services in Tanzania. And then stage 2 and 3 enabled them to grow and gather more evidence on their economic viability and scalability. And today, Zola's raised more than $200,000 in debt and equity and provides energy to over 1 million people.
Wow.
And then, yeah, it's been amazing to see the successes of our grantees. And then the third one I wanted to point out is actually one that should be familiar to Vilgro, which is Maisha Meds. So as you're aware, many pharmacies and clinics in East Africa regularly face stockouts or supply substandard drugs. So many people use unnecessary or often low-quality drugs without first testing to confirm the diagnosis. Maisha Meds provides inventory management software to pharmacies that enables them to better manage the inventory, to reduce the stockouts, and grow their businesses. Maisha works to improve the access to affordable, high-quality medicines and increase testing prior to treatment. So with DIV support, Maisha and the University of California, Berkeley conducted a study in Kenya to study how delivering provider incentives, patient subsidies, or a combination of the two could impact malaria case management. And the results of that study demonstrated that Maisha's platform can substantially incentivize appropriate care, save patients money, and limit the overuse of unnecessary drugs. And so with the help of DIV, Maisha expanded from 200 to 1,200 health facilities and is now scaling that platform to reach more than 500,000 patients across 5,000 facilities in 3 countries. So I hope that gives you kind of like a sense of where DIV grantees can go with the help of DIV support, with the help of DIV funding, and then beyond.
Thank you for that. I really like that you're describing the size of scale. You talked about Dimagi, over 100 countries, you said?
Yes.
That is massive scale. So it helps me to see clearly what you were talking about, where you were talking about better, cheaper, faster, and at scale. So I think that's good information for our entrepreneurs, so that when they're thinking about scale, there's scope for the kind of scale you're talking about. So thank you, Liz. We are done with this discussion, this interview, and I'd just like to invite you to maybe share some final notes of encouragement for potential DIV applicants. What overall advice would you give?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity. And I think I want to just share 3 points for potential applicants. One is, you don't need a professional grant writer or to be a native English speaker to successfully apply to DIV. We aren't looking for lots of jargons or a whole book. In fact, 40% of DIV grantees are local, and 50% of grantees are new to USAID. So I hope that gives some hope to applicants. I think another thing to keep in mind is, as the applicant moves forward in the initial application review, we're going to share targeted feedback. Like I said, and like Bill Grohl likes to think about it, we want to help good ideas grow. And being able to provide that targeted feedback, especially after the applicant's been giving us so much information and so much of their time, we want to help by providing useful feedback for them, whether they're going to apply to DIV again or to any other funder. And then the last thing I think is worth keeping in mind is, we're asking for a lot of information during diligence because we really want to understand the solution and the impact and its reach. Be transparent with us during that process. And I think that's applicable for any applicant reaching out to a funder. Be transparent. Diligence is when you start to build that trusting relationship with your funder. And it's important that throughout that process and the life of the grant, we both trust each other, because it's a relationship.
Thank you for that, Liz. Actually, I have one more question. I'm curious, like during the cycle of a grant, when this grantee has generated enough evidence and want to move on to the next phase, do they have to write a new application, or do you sort of like extend the grant based on the successes you're seeing?
We would, the applicant would have to submit a new application. That would be consistent with like USAID procurement rules as it relates to these type of agreements. So it'll certainly help that they have successfully completed their first grant, and they can speak to that and use that evidence. But everybody gets the same shot, no matter what. That's why also everyone is putting in a new application. We don't just play favorites.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm very grateful for your time and for that very comprehensive study, basically, of the DIV program, and this will be very useful for our portfolio and even outside of our portfolio. I think a lot of companies in our ecosystem would be happy to hear, and you hopefully be seeing more applicants coming out from our contacts following this podcast. So thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.